The subject that I'm going to be talking about, as Ralph in his very generous introduction mentioned, is the enduring importance of the Shah. And essentially, it is an attempt to explain why I spent about 10 years finishing the book that you have to my left, the book called The Shah that Palgrave just published. I think it is increasingly clear, at least to me it is, that the fall of the Shah was one of the pivotal events of the second half of 20th century. In a recent review of this book, in fact, in Wall Street Journal, the reviewer compared the Islamic Revolution of 1979 in terms of its magnitude to the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 and said that is how important, how consequential that event was. The 1917 revolution, we know, brought in Lenin, the Soviet Union, the Cold War. It's hard to imagine a more important event. And he claims, and I don't think he's off, that the Islamic Revolution and thus the fall of the Shah was an event of equal magnitude. So in my view, understanding the Shah is very much about understanding today. It's about understanding Iran today, and it's about understanding why we are where we are today, both domestically in Iran and in terms of Iran's relationships, troubled relationships with the US. I think if you ask any book reader in the English-speaking world, I suspect any part of the world, and ask what are the three major problems about Iran, they would point to Iran's nuclear program, Iran's democratic movement, and they would probably point to events of August 1953 as a turning point in US-Iran relations. August 1953 is when the government of Mossadegh was overthrown or dismissed, depending on whose narrative you believe. The Shah, who had fled, was brought back to Iran, and a new phase in his power began. Some have pointed to September 11 as having its origin in that event. That's how pivotal that event is supposed to be. And the Iranian democratic movement, as I will argue shortly, Iran's nuclear program, as I will try to argue shortly, and the events of August 53, by definition, have all of them at their center the figure of the Shah. And I think it is extremely urgent that we understand him, because understanding him is not just about understanding the past, but it's also really about mapping out the future and understanding why we have had this tortured path to today. If you ask any Iranian, any student of Iranian politics or society, what have been the three defining problems of the last century in Iran, I would think, again, there is some consensus that the three major problems Iran has faced in the last century has been the question of modernity and its fight with tradition, sort of the battle between the moderns and the traditionalists. Very much included in this paradigmatic debate between the traditionalists and the modernists is a question of what does it mean to be Iranian? The question of Iranian identity. Is Iranian identity primarily Islamic, or is Iranian identity a hybrid identity, or is it primarily a pre-Islamic identity? And the Islamic identity is an unfitting, diseased addition to it that has come 1,000 years ago when it has been rejected by the body politic. Third question, in other words, aside from tradition and modernity, the question of identity is, again, the question incumbent in these earlier two issues, is the question or the debate between democracy and despotism, between progress and authoritarianism. The question of whether you can have democracy and progress at the same time, or whether there is something needed in Iran's current political, cultural, social, some would say even ethnic makeup that requires or begets these one form of despotism after another. How is it that we replace the Shah's authoritarianism with a far, far more brutal, more oppressive, less competent, more corrupt Islamic regime? How was it that we got rid of one king to get someone who now has more power than any king ever had, and also claims to speak for God, literally speak for God? Recently, one of his henchmen said, going against the words of Mr. Khamenei is going against God himself. And it is himself God. There's no he, she in their language. In Iran, in Shiism, God is man, and ladies have to just live with the fact that it is a misogynist cosmology. In all of these three questions, the domestic questions and the international three questions that I mentioned, the Shah figures very prominently. And his period, 1941 to 1979, figures extremely prominently. It is the contention of the book that the Iranian democratic movement that we have heard so much about, the green movement that we hear so much about, that created some kind of a mythical almost movement by bringing 3 million people in a city of 12 million people who silently marched and asked, what happened to my vote? Where did my vote go? That movement is in every fundamental composition the same social forces that brought the Shah down. So understanding why the Shah fell, understanding why the coalition was formed against him, and it was a very strange coalition, and I will explain why it is strange, helps us understand why there has been political instability in Iran for the last 30 years. And if American policymakers, for example, had truly studied the case of the Shah's nuclear program and how he went about it, they would have managed, I think, the nuclear negotiations with Iran in a very different way. And I suspect they might have come to better results. And finally, I, in the book, offer a rather different view of August 53. My argument is that the events of August 53 are far more complicated than the narrative hitherto offered by the royalists, which claim it was a day of national uprising, or by the Mossadeqists, who claim it was an infamous CIA coup. I think the reality is far, far more complicated, and I try to explain why it is more complicated and why, in fact, the people who rule Iran today, the clergy, had far more to do with Mossadeq's fall than the CIA ever did. The clear, in my view, unquestionable dominant force whose shift of position essentially completely shifted the dynamics in Iran were the clergy. When they sided with Mossadegh, you could clearly see in the documents the balance of forces was now against Mossadegh. I refer to documents, and documents is really the last reason why we now need another biography of the Shah. There has been about a dozen biographies of the Shah so far. In my view, unfortunately, all of them have been commissioned biographies. Commissioned in the sense that they were either written to demonize the Shah by his opponents or lionize the Shah by his advocates. Many of them were directly paid biographies.